Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to one and all. My name is Toh Ken Lam. I am from the Local Community Engagement Office. Welcome to NTU, one of the top 15 most beautiful campuses in the world, if you had not known. And of course, welcome to, thank you all for attending today's talk. We started this talk in July 2017. So we are going to present a very, I would say, the enlightening talk by our speaker, and of course we have a couple of panelists as well. Now before we go that, I think for those of you who celebrate Lunar New Year, Happy Lunar New Year. And before you leave this lecture theatre later, please remember to collect a pair of Mandarin oranges, auspicious. Wish you good luck, and of course, for the entire 2019. A couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, of course, in case of emergency, I think there are a couple of exits behind you and of course on your sides as well. Okay? And as part of our effort to go green, we are trying to reduce the use of bottled water. So you can see today we do not provide any water for you. I hope you don't mind. But in case you need some drinking water, we do have a water fountain, water cooler up there, not far away from the washroom. So help yourself. In fact, if you look at NTU, our supermarket, Prime Supermarket, and many eateries and shops, we are actually doing away with plastic bags, and of course straws as well. And these are all part of the effort to go green. And in addition, we are also doing away with the pen and pencil survey, pencil and paper survey. So you can see later on we would like you to actually take a look. Maybe you want to scan this QR code, scan this, because we hope that you can actually give us your feedback, your views regarding this talk, and hopefully you can actually do a better job in future. So we can do it later, during the talk, or even after the talk. Okay. Now, a lot of people ask, why are we doing all this free public lecture? We call it Did You Know Monday Talk series. And I think one of the main reasons is we want to actually help Singaporeans appreciate research and its benefits. Of course, while you are here, we also hope that you will spend some time, for those who are not from NTU, to explore NTU, because you can see we have been transformed into a mini city. We have many new buildings, nice eateries, as I said, even supermarket. So take your time and visit, and again visit that again in time to come. Also try to visit again. So the program flow for tonight will be after this. I'll give instruction about our speaker. He will give 45 to 50 minutes of presentation. Following that, we have a couple of top panelists. Each of them will take about 10 minutes to share about who they are, what they do, what organization they are from, as well as their views and thoughts about today's topics. And after that, we have a panel discussion and followed by a Q&A, something that I think you are also looking forward to it. So before we end the talk, of course, I'll present a token of appreciation to our speaker as well as the panelists. So there's the flow of to this evening's talk. So we are very honored to have Professor Shane Snyder to be our guest speaker this evening to talk about environmental sustainability in world's fastest growing regions, challenges and opportunities for water and waste management. Dr. Shane Snyder is a professor of civil and environmental engineering and the executive director of Nanyang Environment and Water Research Institute, NURI in short, at NTU Singapore. Was formerly a professor of chemical and environmental engineering and co-director of the Water and Energy Sustainable Technology Center at the University of Arizona, USA. His research has focused on emerging water pollutants for over 20 years, publishing over 200 manuscripts and book chapters on emerging contaminant analysis, treatment, and toxicology. The editor-in-chief for Chemosphere, Dr. Snyder was invited three times to brief the US Congress on emerging issues in water quality. He is also a fellow of the International Water Association, a member of the WHO's Drinking Water Advisory Panel, served on several US EPA expert panels and the US National Academy of Sciences National Research Council Committee on Water Reuse, and was Lux Research's top 30 leaders in water research. So without further ado, let's put our hands together to welcome our speaker for tonight, Professor Shane Snyder.
There we go. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the very kind invitation to be here and the wonderful introduction. It's a great honor to be here with the NTU and Singapore community. I live just down the street, so it's wonderful to see this gathering of people to hear about new topics, and I look forward to joining myself for future ones. So, today, I wanted to do something a bit different. Usually, I'm speaking about the research I do on emerging contaminants and water treatment. So I wanted to give you maybe a broader picture and hopefully stimulate some discussion with our panelists and with our group so we can all learn a little bit more. Okay. So I have always been intrigued and impressed by the country of Singapore. I've been coming to Singapore now for more than 10 years. I spent 6.5 years back and forth with NUS, a wonderful time there. Now I've been at NTU for about a year. And I've always been deeply moved by the commitment shown by the country of Singapore in water management, water sustainability, advancing water technologies. And of course, with a statement like this from Lee Kuan Yew, that every policy had to bend at the knees of water survival, it's very inspirational to think about, especially now with the emerging economies around us, we're going to talk about that, about what that really means. Because without secure water, we can see economies fail. And I usually show an example of Southern California, where we are experiencing this now, at risk, one of the United States' largest economies, really wondering how they're going to survive in the future. And maybe there's a lot to learn from Singapore. So a lot of ground we could cover in water. And it's always important to remember this nexus between land, water, energy, agriculture. And as we talk about population growth and economic development, it's not just the water, of course, that we're using for drinking, for our homes. We have to think of it holistically, of balancing the agriculture, the waste, and the energy production all in one. So the United Nations set forward a Sustainable Development Goals. Probably many of you have heard about these. And if we look at these sustainability goals more closely, more than half of them can be linked to water, earth, environment, and energy. So not just at a local scale or a regional scale, but really at a global scale, we recognize the importance of our environment and of water and energy sustainability. So when we look at our planet, we think about the first glimpse from space in the late 1960s, our blue planet, and it's hard to imagine that 71% of the entire surface of our planet is water. And when you think of it that way, it makes it a bit tricky to understand why could there be any water problems. We have water everywhere. But getting the right quality water to our urban centers in a reliable and safe manner is not so easy. It's an amazing feat of engineering, and I want to walk you through some of that history tonight. Perhaps ironically, the human body is about the same percentage, where our bodies are literally composed of about 72% water. So our link between water and our health is quite clear, and I'll show you again some examples. Now, when I think about water, first thing I think about are my kids. They absolutely love water, right? I mean, you cannot keep them away from it. They want to jump in. Doesn't matter what the sign says, don't enter, you can't keep them away. But it tells us something about humanity. We are linked to water in a way that's much different than energy. And not to pick on my friends who are in the energy research side, but People connect with water in a very unique way, whether it's children's fascination with enjoying water or adult fascination with enjoying water, at the water festivals of Thailand, for instance, or religious and sacred ceremonies around water. Water has been intrinsic and, of course, essential for human existence, and we've evolved with it over time. But I think we start to take it for granted. Living in a highly developed country like Singapore, most of the United States, North America, Europe, we go to the spigot, we turn the valve, and out comes the water. And I think about, my years on this planet, and how many times I've turned the spigot and water not come on. Almost never. Only if I did something wrong myself, usually. And same with our waste. We flush the toilet, away goes our waste, and we generally don't think about it any further. These systems involve incredible amounts of engineering to make them work. And again, I hope tonight you'll see a little bit of behind the scenes of where we've been, where we're going, and then we'll hear more from our panelists as well. But unfortunately, the whole world doesn't enjoy the water security that we enjoy here in Singapore or other parts of the developed world. In parts of Africa, the burden of bringing water to the household largely lies with the ladies, carrying water back for their families. Tremendous amounts of effort and illness, as I'll show you, associated. This is actually a photo I took myself when I was visiting in India. And the fellow here was offering what he thought was very safe water compared to any other water you could find in that city. Globally, it's been estimated that about 700 million people on the planet do not have access to improved or safe water. So that's quite a bit of people, a big percentage of the world that does not have access. But when we think about sanitation, the numbers are much, much more staggering. It's been estimated that about 2.5 billion people lack access to proper, adequate sanitation. That's about 35%, or a third of the world's population lacks access to sanitation, which causes numerous problems environmentally, disease transmission, etc. And a few of them, case studies we'll talk about tonight. And a sad statistic from this is that about 700,000 children under the age of 5 die each year because of the unsafe water and poor sanitation that they're exposed to. So let's bring it a little closer to home. Let's think about Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is home to about 650 million people. And even for me, having been to Singapore so many times, when I started to look at the numbers, they're really staggering. I think, at least in North America, a lot of us don't realize how many people live in Southeast Asia. We think about China, we think about India, but Southeast Asia has a very vibrant population. In fact, if you look at the population growth in Southeast Asia since the 1960s, you can see that most of the countries have doubled or more than doubled in population over the past 50 years. And some of our countries in Southeast Asia have extremely high populations, like Indonesia at over 260 million people, and continue to grow. Along with that growth in population, Southeast Asia has seen incredible growth economically. And again, we think so much about what's happening in China, and there's good reason to. We're going to look at that a little bit. But think about where Southeast Asia is going. The opportunities, the movement of companies into Southeast Asia is being recognized globally. In fact, a report by McKinsey and Company just last year was looking at the 71 emerging economies studied, both for outperformers and those who have been long-term outperformers. And what we see is that 8 of our Southeast Asian countries are among the top performing economies of the world in terms of growth and per capita gross domestic product. So again, very incredibly fast growth. What's going to happen to that growth next? Well, there's a lot of interesting things happening in politics and changing in the world's dynamics. As we all know, there's a bit of a dispute between the United States and China. We'll have to see where that's resolved, but already companies are taking action. They're beginning to be preemptive in their moves, and some of that activity will be seen and recognized in Southeast Asia. And just another one speaking to this same topic and showing investments increasing up to 18% since the US-China trade war began. In fact, we've seen growth. This is an example in Thailand where car production has ramped up dramatically in their factories as China's production has actually slowed down. So we have a lot of economic growth, a lot of population growth, but still we have a long way to go in terms of catching up perhaps in the environment. The Straits Times in 2016 estimated that 140 million people in Southeast Asia lacked access to safe drinking water, and especially in some of the rural areas of the region. So one of the things I really enjoy about my job here at NTU is that we are fortunate to hold an endowment by the Lien Foundation, which allows us to construct, build, demonstration scale sanitation drinking water systems in the region. So I was shocked at my first visit to a suburb, if you will, an urban slum of Yangon, Myanmar. So we took this photo just a few months ago of what the people were drinking. And I was really shocked. They would collect the water from an open surface drainage collection pond. There were dogs and animals all around it doing what they do best. And they would let the water sit overnight and then they would consume it. No treatment. And certainly it does have consequences to their health. But we can help. I mean, this is a much larger problem than we can possibly solve as one unit. But again, we've really enjoyed the ability to be able to go in and demonstrate to the community, to demonstrate to the stakeholders that it is possible to build water systems that are viable and economically sustainable. In fact, after this project in Yangon, we were called to Napatal, where we entered into discussions with the deputy ministers and with two of the secretary general. So it's really great that we have this capacity, and again, enabled thanks to the Lien Foundation. So what does generally happen? This is well known in economics, right? The Kuznets curve. So we see per capita income increasing, and as it increases, often we see damage to the environment. Maybe less stringent rules on discharge, things like that begin to cause us to pay less attention to the environment, and then we reach a tipping point where we begin to see improvement of our environment. So let's take a look at some of the things that are happening around us. Of course, in China, they have built the world's largest dam, and we know that as we create these dams, it offers benefits in terms of water capacity, reservoirs, hydropower, but it will change the dynamics of the environment. In fact, the Mekong River is facing very severe changes, and there are concerns among the Mekong River countries about whether the dams, not only in China, but within the other regions like Laos and Cambodia, etc. There was an article in National Geographic that spoke to this. Are we building too many dams too fast, too quickly, to realize the long-term consequences of this type of engineering? Another example, this is a space shot, a satellite image of Manila. So you can see downtown urban Manila. If you look carefully, you can see the airport. And what we see is urban drainage into the Manila Bay, a very black colored runoff. Is that hazardous or not? That's a tricky question. It's a public health question, but it's one that I want to probe yet tonight in the time I have remaining. In Malaysia, which has seen tremendous growth in their economy, but yet realizing now that there could be environmental consequences, and even entering into discussions and collaborations among their universities and us right now in looking at how to improve water quality, how can we learn from each other in solid waste management. So a lot of opportunity just across the river. Looking the other way into Indonesia and Jakarta, of course, they've had tremendous challenges in handling solid waste in such an urban, dense, and rapidly growing city. From The Guardian, a photo of someone scavenging garbage along the river in Jakarta. And of course, during the Asian Games, there was a lot of effort to try to clean this up, to try to make things look better, to try to learn about how to improve the quality of their river. How about the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia? This is the largest freshwater lake in all of Southeast Asia. 80,000 people live directly on the lake, and it serves a lot of the needs for the region. But in recent times, the environment, the climate has changed dramatically to what some experts have said could be the tipping point for this largest freshwater lake. And not only is the detriment to the environment, we can think about the impact to the farmers or the people who rely on fishing for their economics. So the long-term consequences, and we're going to have to see what's going to happen in the future, but we should expect or try to be prepared for what the future and climate might look like. Bangkok struggles to stay afloat with rising sea level. But this one is quite interesting to me because Bangkok has two problems. Obviously, they have the problem of rising sea level. Singapore is certainly concerned about this as well. But what I found fascinating, if you look at Bangkok's scenario a little bit closer, you realize that part of the challenge is actually over-pumping the groundwater. So sea level's rising, but the elevation of their city is dropping at the same time. They've overdrafted the groundwater and the city is beginning to subside. Thailand's actually done quite a remarkable job of actually tracking the quality of their rivers. And what they've realized is that, of course, in the areas that are becoming more industrialized or more tourism, they're seeing increasingly deteriorating water quality. But it's, I think, very impressive that they're actually monitoring it and tracking it. And just before the Christmas holiday, we met with the governor of Chiang Mai, who said the king and the princess of Thailand have actually mandated that Chiang Mai clean up some of their canals. And if you've been there, you know that they have quite a challenge ahead of them. Subsidence issue is not unique to Thailand. In Vietnam, you can see in Saigon that they've experienced subsidence from overdrafting the groundwater. And interestingly enough, Jakarta is considered the fastest sinking city in the world. Again, more rainfall than what I'm used to in dealing with the Southwest United States, but this overpumping or overtaxing the groundwater does have consequences. In Jakarta's case, they're talking about potentially a remarkable, almost unimaginable project, which would be at least 32 billion pounds to create this massive seawall to try to deal with the sinking and residing city. So let's switch gears a little bit and look at the food side. So we're talking mostly about urban water issues, pollution. What about food? So rice supplies food for about half of the world's population, 70% of which is considered poor. 90% of the entire world's rice supply comes from Asia, and the vast majority of that comes from Southeast Asia. And there's been a shift. Recently, Thailand has emerged as the top rice exporter in the entire world. This is helped by changes in surrounding countries and how they're buying and trading, but this growth has fueled the economy, at least in part, in Thailand. But nothing comes for free. Land is being changed, land usage patterns are changing. This is causing changes in flooding. And if you look at it even from this standpoint, this is the amount of pesticides that are imported into Thailand from the year 2000 to 2010. The amount of pesticides in 10 years quadrupled the amount. And so we know already that this pesticide use will at least have some bearing on water quality and on the environment. But at the same time, this is more recent, 2015, Thailand underwent one of the worst droughts they've experienced in decades, where 7 of the 67 provinces actually had to go into water rationing, which represent about 1/3 of the entire country of Thailand. And of course, as the drought persists, it also emerges concerns about food and food security. So what about the magic fruit? Probably all of you recognize this. If you're in the United States, you probably have no idea what this is. This is palm oil, right? And I'm just beginning to learn about palm oil. It's kind of fascinating. Palm oil is the most widely consumed vegetable oil on the entire planet. And about half of every packaged good you can find at the supermarket will in some way contain palm oil in one form or another. But you probably know there is beginning to be an increasing debate around palm oil and whether or not we should continue to utilize it. I'm not going to enter into that debate, but it's gaining a lot of attention in terms of environmental impact. So a lot of the palm oil, as I'll show you, is coming from Indonesia and Malaysia, the majority of the entire world's palm oil. But in this case, showing the photo of about 8 million acres of Borneo, which were destroyed to grow palm oil. This is roughly the size of the entire country of Switzerland. So on one hand, economic gain, and the second hand, potentially environmental risk. And it continues. People are continuing to debate whether or not this is an industry that will be long-term sustainable. We have even recently, our own research center, entered into discussions about palm oil mill effluents. Most of them are doing a great job, but trying to achieve even better than they do today. So things like nutrient removal from their streams is an area that we're very interested in exploring and in deploying the technologies like we've developed here at NTU. Lastly, what about fisheries? That's part of the agricultural system as well. So probably many of you know that the world's natural fisheries have been largely jeopardized by overfishing, by seafood, and aquaculture has become a major industry. I've spent time working in Vietnam on aquaculture primarily for prawns, and if you look at the coast of Vietnam, you'll realize that almost the entire coast is lined with aquaculture facilities. However, these are not without their own sets of challenges environmentally, dealing with the waste, dealing with the additives that try to increase the prawn yields or fish yields, and in fact, we have to be cautious as we make this exploration. Here in Singapore, we had efforts as well for aquaculture, some successful, but other times not successful. Challenges due to algal blooms that have happened have completely wiped out entire fish farms. This is from 2015 and another shot from the Straits Times. So it's not always so easy to keep these aquaculture going, and yet it also has potential challenges for the environment. So urbanization doesn't only need water solutions, we also have to have a commensurate amount of waste solutions. I just want to touch on that a little bit in a few slides. So probably many of you have heard about the large Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is largely made of plastics. Plastics that the counter-current currents have accumulated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But to just put this in scale, the area consumed by this patch of floating trash would be 2,200 times the land area of Singapore. So 2,000 Singapores of garbage floating out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But what we're beginning to realize is that plastic has another side effect. As it begins to degrade, there's a lot of microplastics that are shed from this, that are accumulating in fish, and it's causing us to look very carefully at plastics in general. And probably some of you are aware that China recently, a year ago, decided to ban importation of plastics. And some people don't realize what exactly that means. There was a lot of plastic recycling, I say with quotes, in the US and Europe, which was really just moving plastic from some countries to a different country. And hopefully you can see this one. This really fascinated me. A professor from Italy shared this with us just a few weeks ago. This is 2017. And you see the United States, how much plastic's being produced or sent for recycling: Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada. And the flow of the plastics was predominantly to China and Hong Kong, with some representation of Southeast Asia. In just 12 months into 2018, you can see how this shifted incredibly. Now the plastic, due to the ban in China, moved into Malaysia, and then Vietnam, Taiwan, etc. So we're seeing this change recently. I think 2 months ago, Malaysia decided to also ban that importation, and now the amount going to Thailand is instantly went up. And there have been reports that some of it's being burned in non-viable ways and causing health concerns among the public in Thailand. As I started to mention, some of the plastics that are entering the ocean or entering the environment shed and become microplastics, or some microplastics are discharged directly to the environment. And there have been numerous studies that show that these can potentially enter both tap water, and some are also in bottled water, which are coming from the bottles themselves. Of course, pesticides, as I mentioned before, have their way of finding their way into our drinking water supplies. Glyphosate is a very highly controversial herbicide right now, very effective, but it forms relatively stable degradation products which end up ultimately in water. And the last one around this, I wanted to show this because this is going to link to a case study historic story that I enjoyed telling, which links to my own research a bit. In Australia, they've been calling for a ban on an herbicide called atrazine, an extraordinarily controversial chemical, produced primarily by a company called Syngenta in Switzerland, where ironically it's banned. So it cannot be used in the European Union, and now Australia is considering it. But interestingly, one of the reasons driving this is male fertility, that men exposed to high levels of atrazine may exhibit a decrease in fertility. So this was what the entire topic of my PhD research was on, which is a field called endocrine disruption. That is, chemicals in the environment that can mimic and disrupt natural homeostasis of our hormonal systems. So we know about atrazine, we're learning about glyphosate, we're learning about these different chemicals. But let's think about this from a really high elevation. There are over 100 million chemicals registered in the Chemical Abstract Services. That means more than 100 million, and I'm about to show you, more than 130 million chemical structures, unique chemical structures, are known. There are many more that we don't know about. But what's fascinating in synthetic chemistry is how fast it's growing. So it's been estimated that every day we add about 15,000 new chemical structures into Chem Abstract Services. So of these, about 60 million or so chemicals are available commercially, and most of them provide tremendous benefit to public well-being. Think about all the incredible discoveries that have been made, whether it's pharmaceuticals or different types of polymers that have really improved our lives. But how do we determine whether they're safe or not? Well, that's a really tricky topic, and one that's becoming more and more debated. This was in Chemical and Engineering News from the American Chemical Society that said the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is struggling even to keep up with how many chemicals there are in the inventory of the United States. And are those chemicals tested? The vast majority of the industrial chemicals are not tested for human toxicity before they enter the market. So there's a lot of unknowns. And this one goes back to, in the introduction, about my testifying in front of the US Congress. This was what it was about, that we are unable to possibly do toxicity testing on every potential chemical that could enter the environment, our food, our water, etc. And the system is really a broken paradigm. And that's whether it's EPA or World Health Organization, all of it relies largely on animal testing, which is very slow. So, now I want to tell you this kind of fun, I hope kind of fun or entertaining, maybe a little bit scary story. But I'm talking about all this synthetic chemistry. When do you think humans first encountered synthetic chemistry? Just think to yourself, when was it? 50 years ago? We know that's more than that. At least people my age know that. But let's take a look at that. In the 1850s, as they were taking coal and gasifying coal for the lamps mainly in the United Kingdom, they had this tremendous byproduct of coal tar. Really a messy substance. Nobody could really find a good use for it. I'm jumping through a lot of history, but one of the interesting things that was found was that it could be synthesized into a pigment or to a dye called mauve. And I love this story. I'll take a second to tell you about it. This guy Perkin was a graduate student. He was a graduate student when he figured this out. But he was not trying to invent a dye. He was trying to synthesize quinolone. Why quinolone? As a treatment for malaria. People were dying from malaria. They knew quinolone could help. He tried to synthesize it. He accidentally found this purple color. He spilled it on his clothing. He couldn't wash it out. And like any smart graduate student, he filed a patent. He did not tell his advisor. My students who are here never do that. And he got exceedingly wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in Europe at the time. This was the first widely used synthetic chemical in human history. But as we began to look deeper into coal tar and people who were exposed to coal tar, they realized they had an increased incidence of cancer and a decreased fertility. In other words, largely the men who were occupationally exposed were becoming infertile, but they didn't understand why that could be. Jumping a little bit more in time, aspirin, around 1900, this is the first synthetic pharmaceutical in human history. And before aspirin, as far ago as the ancient Egyptians, they were talking about willow bark. So if you had a headache and you had to get willow bark, you had to be very wealthy because the majority of the world could not have access to the active ingredient in aspirin. But around 1900, the Bayer Corporation found a way to synthesize aspirin and it became the first synthesized drug in history. Okay, following on this path, they had purple. The next one was green. Hey, if you have purple clothing, well, let's get some green. Let's diversify. And they came up with a dye called malachite green. And accidentally, they realized that insects who were exposed to the malachite green would generally die. This now became the world's first pesticide. DDT, now we played this game in my lab today. Some people knew about DDT and some have not. DDT has a tremendous history, and most of it's quite bad. I'm going to show you why. But when DDT was first synthesized, following the same synthesis pathways of malachite green, it was considered an absolute marvel of the world, a miracle. Incredibly effective, extremely persistent. You could apply it one time and it would continue to work for a very long time. It was so good that Paul Mueller, who synthesized DDT, won the Nobel Prize. And when I tell this story like to my parents or to my friends back in the United States, nobody knows that somebody won the Nobel Prize for DDT because we only think about the bad history, which I'm going to show you. But when Paul Mueller was able to produce DDT inexpensively, he saved millions of lives, especially in Europe, where malaria was spreading very rapidly, especially in Italy. They began to fog using DDT, and the malaria spread came to a quick end. But no good deed goes unpunished. So we'll come back to this in 1 second. Keeping in chronological order, another one of my favorite papers of all time, published in the journal Science, 1946, was a paper by Professor Schuller of the University of Chicago. And Professor Schuller made a remarkable discovery. What did he discover? He discovered that the natural estrogen that's in all of us, men and women, more in women than men, could be synthesized by other chemical structures, including diethylstilbestrol and including bisphenol A. I wonder if any of you have heard of BPA, bisphenol A. You'll see it in packaging a lot. It does not contain BPA, right? Very controversial. He studied it in 1946 and demonstrated that it could act just like estrogen if you were exposed to enough of it. An animal was exposed to enough. So think in your mind, what an interesting discovery. What did that lead to? It led to something quite game-changing for the world. Coming up in the next slide. So 1951, they start to understand that even plants can naturally produce hormones that would also mimic human hormones, like soy. And then 1952, Professor Schuller again, the same professor who published the paper in 1946 in Science, published the paper saying that DDT could act like an estrogen. Uh-oh. This stuff had been sprayed all over the place. And now he realized that that chemical, that pesticide, could actually mimic natural estrogen in the human body. So where did Schuller's discovery go? It became oral birth control medication in 1960, or at least passed by the US Food and Drug Administration, and was a big game changer around the world. But by 1965, Harvard University conducted a study which is largely unknown. As we get into what I did as a grad student in the next few minutes, we didn't even realize this literature existed when we were working on this in the 1990s. But indeed, Stumm, Zollinger, and Fair published a paper talking about hormones being able to enter river systems through wastewater discharges. And at the end of their publication, they say, you know, sometime in history, under the worst of conditions, we might have to look at this. Could there be a time when there's enough urban density, enough wastewater entering rivers, that it begins to impact drinking water? Well, let's see what happened. 1970, the US government, this predates the US EPA, looked at this as well, and they said, interestingly, the synthetic estrogens, primarily used for birth control, were more persistent in wastewater treatment plants than were the natural ones. In other words, the natural estrogens would enter, largely degrade, but the synthetic ones were more persistent. So sometimes the question comes, I'm going to raise this question at the end, why didn't we do anything? We had the evidence that something was about to happen, but we didn't do anything. Well, we had other issues in the United States at the time, like rivers catching on fire, like air pollution so bad that it looked like nighttime in the daytime. There was also a book that was published, very famous, wonderful book to read, Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson. And in that book, Rachel Carlson speaks largely about DDT. And not just DDT, but could this world of synthetic chemistry someday come back to haunt us? That book largely inspired then President Richard Nixon to sign a bill which created the United States Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. So let's continue with our DDT story just a little bit. 1981, once again, the journal Science, very prominent journal, realized that DDT in the Los Angeles harbor was impacting the reproductive systems of the herring gulls and of the brown pelican. And what's really fascinating about this story is that the DDT that was in the Los Angeles harbor came from the wastewater. Now, not from just normal wastewater, because companies were illegally dumping their DDT. They knew DDT was in trouble, they had big stockpiles, what are they going to do with it? Hey, we'll just dump it down the drain. Which is one of the reasons I think Singapore does a great job of monitoring the sewer shed as well as the watershed. And this DDT reached levels in the ecosystem which even today, in 2019 now, haunt us in Los Angeles with the accumulation in the wildlife. And it's been linked to the breeding failure of the brown pelican, and the brown pelican is now extinct. There are no more brown pelicans. So for me, the big game changer came in 1994, for me personally. As when I started in graduate school, And there was a publication from the United Kingdom. Now, the backstory here, I've gotten to know Prof. Sumter quite well. And I always thought he made this incredible discovery. And he said, no, it wasn't me. It was the people fishing. The average everyday person out recreationally catching fish, maybe taking it home to eat, they opened the fish and they said, wow, these fish look weird. Something's not right inside this fish. They took it to the university. John Sumter and his team looked at it, and what they realized was something quite remarkable. This is the normal testicular tissue of a male fish, and this is what the testicular tissue of the male fish looked like below the wastewater treatment outfall. And what's happening is the male fish is beginning to produce eggs. It's called, also known as hermaphrodism. Now, in nature, there is some natural occurrence of hermaphrodism. But below the wastewater outfalls near London, Prof. Sumter found 100% of the fish were hermaphrodized. That is not normal, that is not natural. But why? What was causing it? Maybe it was DDT, what in the world caused this? And I remember this because my advisor came to us and said, this is something we need to get involved in, we need to understand it, and indeed we did, but not without an interesting occurrence. So what happened in 1996, the US government produced a document which said, we're seeing that same kind of feminization of fish below wastewater outfalls of Las Vegas, Nevada, into Lake Mead, Nevada. Lake Mead, the largest drinking water reservoir in the United States. Between Lake Mead and the river that comes from it in the lower Colorado, 10% of the entire United States population drinks that water. So this became an incredible media story as well. And people were very, very anxious to understand what was going on. So that's when I was very fortunate. I was living in Michigan at the time, got dispatched from Michigan to sunny Las Vegas. That's how I got used to the warm weather, why I wanted to come to Singapore maybe. But I was a student, got moved there, and we had to try to figure out what was causing this amazing impact of the fish. Without diving into deep details, we were able to figure this out through both analytical methods and my very favorite topic, in vitro bioassay. So we were able to use human cells. These are cells for breast cancer tissue, and breast cancer tissue, unfortunately, will replicate very, very rapidly in the presence of estrogens. But we took it a step further. So we had this complicated mixture, we're sorting it out, we're trying to figure out, well, what's in this? And we actually created a cell line where we inserted a luciferase gene so that the cell would produce light in the presence. So if we could upregulate the human estrogen receptor, we get light. It means it's very fast to scan. And we could very quickly find out how much estrogen is in the water and where is it coming from, or where is it eluting. So it allowed us to unravel a very interesting puzzle. And the group in the United Kingdom did this as well. We were on the same track. In fact, I think they published it a year before we did. But this turned into something different. It became much more interesting. Okay, birth control, which is actually used at very low doses, is detectable. Well, what else is out there? Indeed, we found a gamut, hundreds, now thousands of pharmaceuticals we can detect as very complicated environmental mixtures. And of course, the media just loves to run with us, and they come up with the most clever stories. You know, fish on drugs more likely to drop out of schools is one of my favorites. And then testicles shrinking in Las Vegas Bay. Now, nothing gets the attention of the public more than that one, right? And if you ever see a fish with testicles, let me know. They should not. That's a morphological misinformation here. Okay, another book came out called Our Stolen Future, written by Theo Colburn. And that book is a very powerful book, talking about endocrine disruption very specifically. But what really made this book, beyond its own merit, but the Vice President of the United States, who became a presidential candidate, wrote the foreword. And he said, you know, this is something we really need to look at a national level, inspired several monitoring programs from the EPA, which are ongoing today. Well, unless our government's shut down, maybe not today. I don't know if we're up or down right now. You know, keeping with our chronology, you know, again, this became such an incredible story. The city of Las Vegas at this point in time was a booming industry. We have a very famous industry you may have heard of, the gaming industry. And the city really wanted to fix it. And the long story short is we moved to deploy ozonation in our drinking water plants and our wastewater plants. We employed the best technologies that we could buy, and we got the public to agree to these, to help us finance them and move them forward. But again, that question still remained. If there were chemicals in the water that affect the fish, what about me? And it took us a couple decades to work through that and to do the research and to keep up with the technology to gain and regain, I should say, the public confidence. The last piece of the story I just wanted to tell you, because in case you're curious, well, I wonder what all that meant to the fish. There was a study that was done and published in 2007, where the Canadian government and the US government worked together, along with the universities, and they dosed one lake, an entire lake in Canada, with birth control medicine at the same approximate concentration we saw in the environment, a little bit higher actually. And then the other lakes they kept as control. In the lakes they dosed with birth control, within a few generations of replication, as the fish were reproducing, they went extinct. Some species ceased to exist entirely. So this is population level impact. Some species of fish were relatively unimpacted, some species went extinct. So incredible. So my thought is, why did it take so long for us to realize that there was a threat? You know, we knew back in the 1960s these chemicals could enter the environment. We know they're very potent. About 30 years from the first report that they occurred to the first report of impact. And then what technologies could we have used to prevent the reoccurrence of some kind of situation like this? So what can we do in the future? And with the few minutes I think I have left, I want to give you that vision for the engineering. You've heard all this bad news. So is there some good news? Yes, there is. We have the technologies to characterize the environment like never before and to treat almost any imaginable scenario of water and environment. So again, engineering and science are producing and continually producing solutions to help us be sustainable despite our large population and urbanization growth. We've largely mastered the art of water management and engineering. You see examples all around us. And I'd like to just show you a few of the historical ones, like the bamboo water wheels in Vietnam. 2000 BC, the Greeks were experimenting with heating and filtering water and wine to make it taste better, to improve its quality. In hieroglyphics of Ramses' tomb, 500 BC, the Egyptians show hieroglyphics of what looks to be experimentation of coagulation and filtration, or maybe they're smoking a hookah, I'm not quite sure, but it looks, some people think it's treatment. Ancient Hindu writings, 400 BC, recommended using charcoal in sand filtration. Sanskrit writing, 200 AD, recommending filtering with coal and storing in copper to prevent bacteria. 1685, we see a patent on a sand filtration system to filter water, remove turbidity, reduce bacterial loading. Around 1800, we see the development of chlorine gas, which is later used for water treatment. It was 1854 that they saw a very terrible, tragic outbreak of cholera in London, which was later attributed to the drinking water through what they call the Broad Street pump. And John Snow was the now father of epidemiology, who was able to link that pump to the spread of cholera and subsequently remove the pump handle to try to prevent this from spreading even further. And by the way, it happened not only in London, it also happened in New York City. So the death rate for typhoid fever, you can kind of see a trend from when we began to chlorinate the water to a great reduction in disease. Many scientists, myself included, would tell you that chlorine has probably saved more human lives than all the pharmaceuticals combined in human history. So as we think about disinfection byproducts, stuff like that, I'm not going to get into it. We got to remember that chlorine is paramount. Disinfection is paramount to human health. So So what about regionally here in Southeast Asia? Of course, some of the greatest engineering feats happen right here in our region, whether it's Angkor Wat, the water temples of Bali, Central Java, or Ayutthaya in Thailand. These all had water movement, canals, moats, all this incredible engineering. And some of these structures have withstood tsunamis and earthquakes. We can hardly build buildings like that today. So incredible what kind of engineers we had back in the day. Here in Singapore, of course, we've come a very long way. And again, I think it's great to watch even our surrounding communities or nations begin to emulate the good work that's been done by Singapore PUB and the country as a whole. Of course, Singapore continues to grow. I think it's fascinating to see that from the 1960s to today, there's been about a 23% increase in the land area. And Singapore has led the way in development of systems like New Water. It's able to recycle water in a very sustainable way, in a very safe way, and demonstrated this over and over. And some of the larger and more advanced desalination systems in the world. Here at NTU, I wouldn't be complete without wrapping up and tell you just a few, in 2 minutes, what we do. You know, we create these pan-academic or pan-university institutes like NURI. There's also Arian for Energy, or several of them. But NURI, which I'm very honored to be part of, and many of our team members are here making me nervous, but we cover a diversity of environmental topics. It's really fun. You know, it's a lot of excitement, and I would certainly invite all of you who haven't seen NURI or would like to be part of it to please contact us and come by. We are quite a big entity. We have more than 300 people, published over 1,000 journals, 135 intellectual property disclosures, 7 spin-offs, and we're located predominantly at Clean Tech Park, just down the street. Our major cores are biotechnology, environmental chemistry, materials, modeling, sensing, resource recovery, and solid waste, and perhaps our most well-known center being our Membrane Technology Center. So what do? Biotech, we work on wastewater treatment solutions. We're trying to be not only energy neutral, but could we become energy positive? Even the latent heat in our wastewater, could we begin to harvest that? We're trying to think of new ideas. Our food waste, we have been awarded a grant to build a prototype food waste system here on our campus at one of our canteens, converting our food waste into biogas and fertilizer. And my own area, I'm getting able to play in new technologies with our medical school and looking at more rapid ways to use biological assays to screen for environmental quality. In our chemistry group, we do a lot of work on advanced oxidation. How can we degrade pesticides or other chemicals into things that are benign and not harmful to human health? Can we build things like sorption? We've built materials for disaster relief that can absorb water like a sponge, squeeze the water back out, and it's disinfected. Extremely beneficial, like for tsunami relief. Or resource recovery. Things we've been throwing away, garbage, can we find new ways to recover precious metals, maybe rare earth elements? A very exciting thing, it's not too far down the street here at TUAS. We opened, just recently was handed over to us, a gasification system. We take 100%, or nearly 100%, of the mixed solid waste of NTU is now going to our own facility, our own test bed, to look at the latest generation of technologies in gasifying, which is producing less residuals, less materials going to Semicol, and better able to deal with hazardous waste. Of course, we monitor air quality, making sure that we're doing things in a safe manner, and we've even invented new techniques to convert plastic waste into high-value materials like carbon nanotubes. In membrane technology, again, a dominant force here at NTU, developing new membranes. For me, one of the most interesting being biomimetic membranes that are mimicking nature, using the same types of protein channeling that nature uses, but mimicking them and incorporating them in an engineered way. Different types of modules, different types of sensors, different kinds of configurations. So NTU is only one part of the bigger portfolio of the country of Singapore. Great work at NUS, PUB leading the way as our national agency. And I'd just like to say, as I'm concluding, is that I hope I've shown you today that there's a lot of challenges out there, especially in our neighboring regions. But Singapore has become the global hydro hub that people are emulating. People are picking up our technologies. It's helping our economy. These are not my figures. These are figures I got was provided by the Economic Development Board, saying that we're adding about 1.6 billion USD of money into our economy from the environment and water sector, and have created over 14,000 new jobs. So what's next? This was in the newspaper about 1 month ago. I was surprised when they called me and said, well, what about rising sea level? Is that a threat to all these great things, the marina barrages, the catchments? Well, there's always going to be challenges, but what's important is to be prepared for those challenges. And so what I said, and I think what you'll see a lot of people are saying, is that, we have to do our best to mitigate the changes and damage to our environment, but we can also turn this into an opportunity to learn more, become more educated, to deploy our technologies, and to become a role model for our region. And in doing that, I'd like to say, maybe the first time some of you have seen this, NTU, under our president, Subra Suresh, has a very bold initiative to become the world's most eco-friendly campus. And from the NURI side, we are very interested in potentially becoming a net zero water campus, at least demonstrating we have the capacity, we could do this, net zero waste and converting all of our mixed solid waste and food waste into energy, and really closing the loop on the campus as a prototype city of the future. So for all of you that are part of the campus community and surrounding neighborhoods, I think this is something you should really watch. It'll be very exciting for us. We had 3 meetings with the president this week alone on this topic. So my final slide, you're probably wondering, wow, there's a lot of slides, isn't it? So this is a statement from our current PM who said, look, all of these efforts to overcome our challenge of water have turned something that was a big vulnerability into a strength. And now the water industry indeed is giving back. So as you pay your water bills, as you pay your taxes, remember that reinvestment into research is critical to be ahead of the game, to be prepared, because without water security, the economy cannot sustain, not just here, but in any country. So with that, I did a lot of talking. I think I need some water now. I'm always happy to talk to folks in the community, our students, and my other colleagues that are here. And with that, I took a lot of time. I'd like to bring our panel up, let them say a few words, and then open up for all of you to ask us questions. So.
Okay. Wow, what an insightful sharing. Let's give Professor Schneider a round of applause. Next up, I would like to invite one of the, who would like to go first? Okay, maybe let me invite Miss Victoria Rigby-Delman. She's the Senior Counsel, Water Supply and Sanitation Global Practice at the World Bank. We would like her to share a bit about herself, what she does, her organization, and maybe her views about the future of these topics. Right? Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. Everything that Professor Shane said is really what I live and breathe on a daily basis. So I just want to introduce you to the World Bank and just a little bit about what the water practice of the World Bank is doing. So the World Bank has 189 member countries. So our shareholders are countries around the world, both developed and developing. We've got staff from more than 170 countries working for the World Bank Group. and we've got offices in over 130 locations. And our mission is to eradicate extreme poverty and to ensure shared prosperity in a sustainable way. So it's not a meek mission. We are trying to eradicate extreme poverty. The World Bank Group has three main different entities. One is the World Bank, and then we've got the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and MIGA, which is less known. The World Bank, which is the bit that I belong to, lends money to governments. So we are lending money particularly to developing countries. So our clients in this region, Indonesia is a big client, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, China is a little less now, but it's still there. So we have a lot of the issues that have been raised earlier are things that we're having to think about. And we lend money. We also offer guarantees to developing countries and for them to sort out their water and wastewater problems. IFC lends money to private sector entities working in these communities, and MIGA offers risk insurance, political risk insurance. The Singapore Infrastructure Hub has been here. We were invited by the Singapore government to open an office here a few years ago to serve predominantly this region and also to some extent South Asia, and also to be able to learn from the Singapore ecosystem. So I regularly come and play again to you to find out what innovations there are going on. We have a lot of knowledge exchanges with PUB so that our clients can really see what Singapore is doing, and we can also learn from some of the amazing innovations and the technology that is being developed within the research institutes as well. The water practice of the World Bank, again, we like to have these grand visions. So we have a water secure world for all, and as you saw earlier, we've got some huge challenges in this region trying to achieve that. So we are trying to reach out to invest in effective and sustainable water and sanitation solutions so that we can achieve universal access and also water security, so dealing with the pollution issues. I know we've run through these already, but obviously the focus on the sustainable development goals. So 2.1 billion people are without safely managed water services in the world, and 4.5 billion without safely managed sanitation. In Indonesia alone, on the sanitation side, only about 1% of all of Indonesia's urban wastewater is actually treated. So that's a pretty significant percentage that is not being treated and is going into the water courses. In Jakarta, it's about 7%. In Vietnam, it's about 10%. And picking up on the discussion on the Mekong, one of the things that I'm involved in at the moment in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, where increased salination in the water, which is partly due to climate change, but is also partly due to upstream damming, is causing huge problems because the population is dependent on groundwater at this point for most of the population of the Mekong for its drinking water supply. And so we're having to think about alternatives and helping the government think through investments to actually bring in water from elsewhere. So more than 2 billion people are globally living in countries with excess water stress. So too much, too polluted, too little. In the next 3 decades, the Water Scarce Cities Initiative estimated that demand for water in cities is projected to increase by 50 to 70%. 21 cities in Asia, including New Delhi, Chennai, Bangalore and Hyderabad, are predicted to run out of groundwater by 2020, which would affect 100 million people. And there are very significant impacts from the economy. The big need, if we're going to achieve SDGs in water is that the annual spending is going to have to increase very significantly from 35 billion to 114 billion. And so that's one of the things that we try to help governments think about. And in particular, I work on trying to think about how to crowd non-traditional sources of finance and private finance into the water sector to really try and crack this problem. And probably of that, about 2/3 needs to go to sanitation and wastewater. So it's a very significant amount we're talking about. So what we do in the global water practice is we lend money, and so our water portfolio is now roughly about $30 billion US. But we also are a knowledge broker and thought leader, and that's where we like to be able to interact with institutions like yours and to really be able to present to our clients some of the best solutions around and building partnerships and coalitions for change. And from my perspective, we need to clean up water sources, obviously provide safe drinking water and bring improved sanitation and wastewater, and also think about improvements in efficiency and irrigation. We need to come up with cost-effective solutions. So that's again where the brilliant minds at NTU can really help think about solutions that can bring both capital and operating costs down. And some of the work that PUB has been promoting in relation to bringing the cost of desalination is something that, in turn, developing countries can benefit from. And then, of course, the knowledge exchange and trying to bring the public and private sector together to really deal with these massive challenges that are facing us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Elman. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Pang Jimeng. Dr. Pang is the Director of Industry Development of PUB, our Singapore National Water Agency. You want to talk about, yeah. No slide?
Hi, good evening. I have no slides. I'll just briefly introduce myself. So I'm Jimeng from PUB. I don't think my organization needs any introduction in Singapore. So we are the water authority here. The only misconception I would like to address is that we no longer regulate power. Yeah, in case you are still wondering. So that has been corporatized sometime back in the early 2000s. First of all, I think I would like to congratulate Professor Shane Snyder for the very insightful presentation that he had. In fact, I think your account for the synthetic chemistry actually fills up and giving me more insights as to why certain decisions that we have undertaken in the development of new water, as I've seen, perhaps, yeah, and this really fills up some of the knowledge gap that we have. So thanks for the presentation. So for me, I think PUB itself, we are really the water regulator here. So everything that we do centers around water. So what this means is that we will take charge of managing stormwater. The moment the rain hits the ground, it collects in our drains and it goes into our reservoirs. And then we will treat that water and after that send it to your homes as well as the industries for use. Subsequently, we will then collect back all those water and send it through processing through wastewater treatment to eventually either discharge to the sea or converted that to new water. Of course, in some time in mid-2000s, we also started doing seawater desalination. So really, we are the agency that deals with water here. And I think at this point in time, I would just like to let us think about this statement that we have said. We have always said that water is an existential issue in Singapore. So reflecting more deeply, why is it an existential issue? So why? Really, there's really only one fact. There's really no substitute for water in the world. If you look at it, if you think about it, if there's not enough food, if there's no rice, you can perhaps change to meat, or you can eat something else. But if there's no water, you can't find an alternative to drink. Then, if you think about the photos that were shown just now about how the Mekong is drying up, where rivers are running dry, the fact of the matter is that there's also no international market for water. You can't purchase water from anywhere. So that is the reason why underscores why water is so important to us, really. Yeah, so with that, I think I will just stop here for now and perhaps we can discuss more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pang. May I invite the two panelists as well as our speaker, Professor Schneider, to take up the position, and of course our Prof. Schneider will also double as the moderator for this panel discussion. So can I pass the mic to you, Jane? There you go.
Okay, and so now for the hard part, right? So what I'd like to do is change form a little bit. I think I'd like to open it to the audience first, and then we have some things that we can think about among ourselves, because I have questions for them. But is there any questions that the audience would like to ask of any of us? Yes. Oh, here we have one. Oh. Do we? Yes, here. Oh, I'm too fast.
Good evening. My name is Lim. I would like to refer to Oregon, US, whereby the water pollution apparently caused a lot of distress and poisoning to the American citizens staying there. America, with a lot of big legal issues, big government, and yet such thing can happen. Could Dr. Shannon provide some background and what caused this failure that American citizens get poisoned by their own water supply? While I don't expect this to happen in Singapore, but maybe some of the gaps you show can make us realize more what went wrong, and hopefully it don't happen here or around this region. Thanks.
So the hardest question ever. So I'll try to explain it a bit, and you're welcome to elaborate if I'm not covering it. But first of all, a lot of the examples I was showing at the beginning were before the U.S. even had an environmental regulation strategy. I mean, we had simple regulations that happened from the 1960s forward. And I think, like a lot of countries, we started with the basics. Pathogens, E. coli, the things we know are acutely toxic, and the heavy metals. So we've continually migrated over time. So some of the acute poisonings, if you're talking about the pathogen, I didn't even get into it, but we have had outbreaks even into the 1990s. But after these things have happened, we learned to change the regulations to try to be more protective. The endocrine disruptor story, I want to be clear, that was really an ecological impact. The human health side of this is not a drinking water story, really. That the endocrine disrupting chemicals are actually much higher in concentration in food supplies, in the atmosphere. Drinking water is not the predominant source. But for the fish, living in the wastewater, that was a whole different story. So, how could something like that happen? There's a lot of reasons. I'm a little bit skeptical sometimes of how the regulations are built, whether that be, frankly, the WHO or the EPA. Because again, the chemical synthesis is happening so quickly that I didn't get into the research, but this new paradigm of potentially using human cell culture or zebrafish embryos or some way to have a biological reading of toxicity faster than you could do animal testing to figure out if something's dangerous or not. It's too slow. The answer is really that things are too slow. And one last comment about the US system. Our system is much more complex in that we have such a big land area, and each state can regulate separately from the federal government. The EPA only sets the blanket minimum requirements, but then each state can set its own regulations to be more stringent, I'll say. So California is probably the most stringent, but also the wealthiest of our states. And you can really see a relationship generally between how much income or wealth a state has and their environmental protection. So there's a really close correlation. Oh, we can have an extra one. This one.
I'm sorry. Basically, my understanding of the issue then reported was that the government knew there was problem with the water. They allow it to continue, and the population the water get contaminated, and the people have to buy own drinking water and run out of bottled water, and a fiasco happened. My point is not so much science. My point is the government. Your comment on what failure, in this case, states to states government, or the whole federal government that's boiling up in a rich first world country, USA. I'm therefore now bringing it back to Singapore or regional around countries in this region. Can it happen? That's my point. Thank you.
I'll try to elaborate a little bit. It's a good point. I understand where you're coming from. So, first of all, it really goes back to what I said earlier, that the regulations were trying to keep up with the most imminent health threats. And the whole story of the endocrine disruptors was small against our rivers burning, against overt toxicity from heavy metals. The things that were happening, they were taking them in prioritization. Knowing that there were estrogens in the water, nobody predicted that those concentrations would be enough to impact the fish. And those concentrations, again, are not drinking water. They were not at any time related to human health. This was an ecological issue and wastewater issue and discharge. We have had more recent trouble like with lead and the distribution system and leaching, and then it got into how do you monitor properly, and it's always evolving. But I still think that drinking tap water is probably the safest thing we do. The cases of risk from drinking water versus almost every other risk I can imagine are de minimis. So we actually enjoy a very safe water, but I think it's important to keep our guard up. I think it's critical to stay ahead of the curve, but we don't see this overt toxicity from chemicals in the water. That was more of a case for the environment, for the ecosystem. So I may have confused them a bit, but they're always trying to keep up. But the regulatory process is very slow and very politically charged. And if I dare say, in the United States right now, we're in a very different climate than we were under the previous president. And so we are undergoing a lot of back and forth, and that's the US way. And I certainly wouldn't advocate that it's the best way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I just wanted to ask, from the research point of view, what are the emerging issues with water treatment and management, and also what are some specific case studies, and what are the new technologies that could tackle these emerging problems? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps I will take this as the start. So I think tonight we are dealing with Prof. Shin. What Prof. Shin lastly has covered is the issue of water quality. So water quality remains an important priority within PUB. So we continue to invest money into water quality research, and largely we do that together with collaborations with people like Prof. Shin and as well as our local universities. The other priorities for water in Singapore is what I alluded to earlier in my comment, is really a central question of scarcity. So a large part of our R&D is also devoted to trying to increase the quantity of water in Singapore. So what do I mean? So over the years, we have diversified our water supply. We now not only have water from our reservoirs, we are also having water from seawater desalination as well as water reuse, which is new water. So what this means is that if we look at how the trends that's going on at the moment, we have climate change coming. What this means will be that increasingly we will feel the vagaries of weather on our impact of our water supply from our reservoirs. So to mitigate this, we have to increasingly rely on the two other water sources, which is desalination and water reuse. And this actually shifts our dependency on water into a form of energy. So what this means is that because these are both very energy intensive type of processes, what we need is really to find ways to reduce energy consumption in these two processes. So one project that we have undertaken for, I think, I must say for maybe perhaps even for the past 10 years, was to find ways to reduce the energy for seawater desalination. The longer term goal, actually the midterm term goal, I would say, is to try to halve that energy consumption required for seawater desalination, with the eventual long-term goal of maybe bring it down to, let's say, perhaps 1 kilowatt hour per meter cube. By comparison, the current technologies now is 3.5 kilowatts per meter cube. So that is the longer-term aspirational goal. So we have made some progress in these areas. So the first area would be in the form of electrochemical desalination. So the current state-of-the-art technology involves passing seawater through RO, reverse osmosis membranes, to produce that kind of desalinated water. But by doing so, we are actually pushing water through a membrane. By using this newer electrochemical desalination method, what we are doing is that we are taking the ions out of the seawater. So we are moving a lot less mass out of the water, leaving behind a clean stream of water. So that particular R&D is ongoing. So we are working with the company Evoqua to try to scale up this particular technology. In the longer term, I think Prof. Xuan has already talk about what we are doing. We are looking at incorporating biological channels, which are proteins essentially, onto the surface of membrane process on the surface of membranes. This would facilitate the passage of water through the membrane while rejecting the contaminants. So with this particular study has been also going on for at least a good few years. What we have achieved is that we have been able to demonstrate the stability of such a membrane in the lab scale. But that one has, I think, some more ways to go before we can pilot and eventually scale it up to a bigger scale. Yeah, so this gives a flavor to what our focus is. The focus is on increasing water supply will be to try to mitigate the amount of energy we need to produce the water. Because ultimately, when we go to these two sources of water that is more weather independent, we will need to take care of the energy demand, because we are really shifting from a dependency from water to energy. Yeah. So maybe on the other side.
So we're a little bit at the other extreme, in a way, particularly in a lot of the places in rural areas or in peri-urban areas in our region, where one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is the issues of very poor sanitation that is then causing problems in our water resources, but also having an impact on, there's a linkage with stunting, from malnutrition and from bad sanitation. So they're actually probably quite simple solutions that are needed, but it's very significant investment. And we need to be moving away from the very traditional idea of having very large wastewater systems in a lot of these areas to thinking about more decentralized type systems. And again, trying to come up with cheaper and simpler mechanisms for doing that. And then in this region, we are actually having to see some of our countries resorting to desalination. So I pointed out in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, where actually they're likely to have to turn to that, particularly in the coastal states. And even though the price has come down quite significantly, it's still, the cost of desalination is probably still about 3 or 4 times the actual tariff that customers currently pay in that area. So trying to think about how we can really bring some of the costs down in some of these technologies is really crucial.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit from a technology side, but then a little bit of the perception from the region. But in the high-tech world, I first would say that what's really been exciting at NTU is multidisciplinary approaches. When we start to sit down with our friends that are in the Photonics Institute or in chemical engineering or medicine or even the business school, social science, we come up with new ideas. And I think one of the areas I think we're all agreeing on for the future will be sensor technology. This plays into the water quality, but not just water quality, even water volume. And being able to very accurately, instantaneously measure things. And this would also go back to helping for water safety for a long run, because sometimes in some of our cases where we've had trouble, back to the US example, these have been for failures that happen pretty quickly, but the water's contaminated. We may not even realize it till it's far too late. But if we had a way to measure that water quality, especially something that is small, deployable, maybe every house would have one, who knows? But that future of having big data, sensor technology, artificial intelligence maybe that's back controlling our treatment system, I think would really play into the energy side, so we're not overdosing. Well, we have an interesting thing we're working on now for trying to track ocean water quality and have the treatment kind of adjust as it goes. So I think those are really exciting, and they cross a lot of boundaries. For me personally, my favorite one, I'll go back and say, is the in vitro bioassay technology for water safety, because again, I see no other possible answer for the chemical mixture toxicity screening. But then lastly, I'd just like to add back into what Victoria was saying. You know, we recently had a meeting that Singapore PUB organized called the Water Academy, which was really they had an impressive group of speakers, except me, maybe I was one of them, but we had a great group of lecturers come in. But the audience was really diverse. I mean, folks from Mongolia, from all over, and a lot of them asked similar questions, and it was really hard to answer that. They would ask, like, what should we prioritize? What should we focus? Because our economy isn't quite the same as Singapore. So how do you pick what to tackle first? And so I always come back to this basics of, like, let's think about this high-tech future, but let's not forget the low-tech, always disinfect, watch turbidity, these simple solutions to start with. And as our philanthropic arm I mentioned briefly, as we're building systems, we are taking on some of that responsibility, and it's tricky to balance, you know, the high-tech world with what is employed in reality and can be maintained. So, but the future's bright. I think, again, in closing, this idea of really crossing the sciences and everybody working together is really key. Here's one.
My thanks to the speakers and the panelists for sharing your experience and knowledge. I would like to frame my question by referring to the Laos dam collapse last year. So it was a disaster that had tremendous impact on the community and the environment in the region. My question is not so much on newly constructed dams, but on aging or badly maintained dams in the region. Such dams may have accumulated pollutants like heavy metals over the years, so if they were to fail, they will have tremendous impact on the community and environment. So my question is whether the funding agencies have sights on such problems, and also is there anything that we can learn from what the states have studied on this issue over the years? Yeah.
So I can touch on the Laos experience and also elsewhere in the region. So we've had a very significant increase in demand for help, looking at existing dams, looking at dam safety and whether the structures can be improved. The one in Laos that collapsed is actually a mud dam. So lots of them are the ones that are balancing dams. They're not structured like the Hoover Dam. They really are just mud packed. But then even cases where you do have very sophisticated structures, I think that the one in Brazil that just collapsed this week with horrendous impact was a more sophisticated version. It's a big challenge, and even with newly constructed dams, there can be issues. But there's a lot of expertise in the region. I think Japan and Korea particularly are leading the charge on all of this, really understanding the impacts also in the region where you've got the Ring of Fire, the impact of earthquakes on dams, etc. So we're certainly seeing an increase in trying to help with existing dams, and then also to just be much more stringent about the standards that are applied when building new ones.
And I'll just make a quick comment. It's not related to the dams, but when you mention infrastructure, you know, in the U.S., this is one of our biggest challenges, is actually the pipelines and the general infrastructure around water. You know, we've got a good regulatory process. We're always trying to improve it. It's not perfect, but we are suffering dramatically from the aging infrastructure, the concrete pipes under New York City. I mean, some of these more than 100 years old, and they're tremendously leaky. We know that. But we're also realizing that, you know, some of our sewer lines are leaking even worse and contaminating the underground aquifers that other people are using for drinking water. So for sure, we have to keep our mind on infrastructure. Dams are maybe the most prominent ones we can see. But what's underground, or what's behind the walls in our houses, like the lead issue we've had in the United States, we can't forget about infrastructure. And often, especially, you know, being at a technological university, we're always thinking about these next, you know, exciting things, but we can't forget about the pipes and the basics of conveyance. They're just as important for water safety. Any other questions or comments? Get two, good. One here in the front, and then one here.
Hi, I'm Song Ling. I'm very interested in the Mekong Delta issue. Do you mind explaining more what is the government doing or what are scientists doing regarding this issue? And can you explain whether stream agriculture is a better solution?
Okay, so the issues are twofold. So I think picking up on the first question we had earlier on monitoring and regulation is also something that I think is really important not to forget. That, you know, infrastructure is on the one hand making sure you've got good monitoring and you know what's going on. And in a lot of the countries that we work in, it's very difficult to even know what the water quality is because there isn't the sort of monitoring that you enjoy here in Singapore. Same with looking at the pollutants in the rivers, etc. So I think that's a crucial piece. And in Vietnam, we're working both on sort of the regulatory side, supporting there, trying to think through how they monitor, for example, industry. And Ho Chi Minh City is the extreme, but even elsewhere, monitor industry taking water from groundwater, which they're not supposed to. It's actually now it's being discouraged, and they've now got decrees against it. So it is against the law to do that, but it's happening anyway. How do you stop them from doing that? So looking at it from the sort of regulatory side, but also helping them to think through how they are going to bring these solutions and bring water to these areas. There's the issue obviously around agriculture and whether you can move away from into less thirsty activities in the Mekong. And in fact, there has already been that shift in favor of fish farming. So that's one aspect that has been happening. And they're trying to reduce again the amount of groundwater that's taken for irrigation. So there's, on the regulatory side, there's quite a lot going on. But then also thinking about on the drinking water side, if we're going to have to use more expensive sources, whether it's taking water from a distance up the river, or it's about desalination, who's actually going to pay that extra cost? Is it going to be the consumer or the taxpayer? And so helping governments to think through that as well as support them in financing the infrastructure.
I'll add just a little bit on the Mekong, just because it's something I'm very passionate about. We've enjoyed and studied the Mekong for quite some time, and to watch the development on the Mekong is, for me, a little bit scary how fast it's happening. In the United States, right or wrong, we have made the decision not to construct new dams. So to construct a dam in the United States would be I can't even imagine it happening anymore, not because of the human side of it, because of the ecological. The environmental regulations are so stringent that to try to dam a river system would be now very difficult. Now, we already built all of our dams, so maybe that's a selfish thing to say, we've dammed the Colorado. But we've also seen what happened to the Colorado River as we built these multiple dams. Now the water doesn't even make it into the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. It's literally dry, and so the entire delta and biodiversity has been destroyed. So my interest, or even concern that I would just voice, is in what's going to happen to the biodiversity of the Mekong, one of the richest biodiversities in the world. That is going to shift, and I think that's inevitable. And I'm not sure if you asked about the shrimp, but the shrimp story from 2012 was fascinating, when essentially all the prawns in Southeast Asia died in 1 year. All the prawn farms. It started in China, spread down through through Vietnam, went around Singapore, up through Thailand and Malaysia. And that started because the aquaculture was, we believe, too dense. They had too much density in the aquaculture. A virus, a pathogen erupted in China, discharged into the ocean and spread down the coast. So how fast that happened was really scary. But we spent a lot of time with the Vietnamese government during that period and talking to them, and they were voicing their concerns. Being the last in line for the Mekong is not an enviable situation. So it'll be interesting to see the future of it. We had another question further back.
I have two questions. The first one is for Prof. Shen. When I was doing my master project back in China, we detected EE2, synthetic estrogen, in the feces of milk cow. So, but we made a lot of effort for the detection method. We used liquid phase extraction and LC mass. But EE2 pose very serious endocrine disrupting effect on human being, on fishes or human being. But it's very difficult to detect. So if we cannot detect it properly, how can we control it? I think similar things happen to POPs and other emerging pollutants. So is there any a better solution to this problem? And sorry, and my second question is for Ms. Dauman. Can you talk more about economic inequality and environmental pollution? For example, developed countries are setting their manufacturing plants in ASEAN or China, but is there mechanism to make them work together with local governments to amend the damages if they've done? For example, like economic approach, like tax or some environmental fees. Okay, thank you.
Well, to your first question, that's very near and dear to my heart, because this is exactly what I study. And in some ways, it even ties to our first question we got. So how do you know that something is clean just because it's non-detectable? I'm going to extrapolate a bit from what you said. But analytically, it is very hard to detect some of these very potent chemicals. It's still difficult to do it. You know, the technology in LCM, SMS, not to get into too many acronyms, but the analytical technology has blossomed. It's gotten more sensitive. We have new ways to separate complex mixtures with multi-dimensional separations. So of course that technology continues to evolve. But I don't think it'll fix the harder question of what else is out there that we're exposed to, but we don't know we're exposed to until perhaps it's too late. And that plays right into at least my own philosophy that the primary way we can deal with this for environmental samples will be, in my opinion, in vitro bioassays. They are incredibly sensitive because not only from the 90s, you know, the work we were doing with producing light and gene expression. Now we can watch transcriptomics. We can actually watch RNA expression in near real time. We can watch cells begin to respond. And the nice thing about it is it tells us more than just is one chemical present. It tells us something about the entire mixture. So if we can pick endpoints that are relevant, let's just say for drinking water, and create a battery of in biological assays, I think that's much more powerful than just trying to look chemical by chemical with a mass spectrometer. Even though most of my career was built on that, I still believe very strongly that the future is going to be moving towards in vitro and tissue cultures, organoids, multiple tissues on a chip. The same thing the pharmaceutical industries are developing now to discover new pharmaceuticals. I think we need to apply them in water and make them cost effective. But analytical detection and knowing if something's a false positive, all those things are very complicated, but it's getting better. So.
So in relation to the economic pollution and the inequalities, the first thing is that, for instance, in China, they've woken up to the issues around pollution in rivers, and actually there's now some quite stringent legislation and regulations that are in place. Obviously, enforcement is an issue. But what you're seeing, I think, throughout the region, to a greater or lesser extent, and in countries where there is better regulation, I think it's happening more, is recognition by, or industries being incentivized or penalized to make sure that they do some primary treatment before they put their discharge from textile industry or whatever into the system. And in places like Bangladesh, they're actually looking at just ensuring that industries are, particularly industries that are polluting industries, are based in economic zones where they actually have the treatment centralized, and they're obliging everybody in the economic zones to follow the regulations. So it's gradually happening. I think it's been a slow process, and it's only just now that the region is really embracing it. And I think countries in the region are. There's a huge gap still, and it's one of the areas that I'm very interested in exploring, particularly when thinking about how we clean up our rivers in this region, to what extent we can really push industry to be doing a better job, whether that's through incentives and carrots or it's through penalizing them. In the US and in Europe, a lot of this was solved through having environment agencies with incredible powers. They can fine huge amounts, particularly in the US, but even in Europe, there are quite significant fines that can be applied. And until you're in a situation where that can happen, then industry will always balance the benefit of cheating the system against actually paying up. And so it's really important that the regulation is pushed, and that countries that take a lead on this, and then that if they are requiring the treatment and pushing the industries to do it, that will then essentially be passed on to the consumer ultimately. So, and taxes are always, also there are different mechanisms for charging taxes to industries and things. So there are a whole range of solutions that can be applied, and governments just have to recognize the problem and then start thinking about ways to address it.
I have another question here.
Hi, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. My name is William Teo. I have two questions. One for Dr. Pang. And my question is, we have heard of the constant outbursts on water supply to Singapore. Would Singapore be water sufficient someday? And my second question to Ms. Victoria is, I'm going to ask you a question that may expose my ignorance. But after leaving this place, I think I'll be smarter. Where does the World Bank get the money from? You seem to be very rich. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So that question, I guess, is a $1 million question, right? So you're saying whether you're referring, I guess, to the current, I would say, disagreements or some kind of differences in opinion about the water supply situation with Malaysia. So the fact of the matter is that this particular issue is long drawn. But I just take the same category that under the 1962 Water Agreement, they are legally bound to sell to us 250 million gallons per day of water on a daily basis. So this particular agreement is attached to our separation agreement and registered with the UN, which means that it is a legally binding one, and any unilateral party that breaches the agreement actually calls to the fact that they are questioning the sovereignty of Singapore. So on that front, I think whether we will see that being self-sufficient is the answer to the problem, I would think yes, that can be a solution. But as to whether we will ever be self-sufficient, I guess eventually we'll probably get there. If you look at the way that the economy is growing, we will need more and more water. I think just now Prof. Shane has showed that our projection has been that our water demand will probably double in the next 50 years or so, 40, 50 years. At the same time, if you look at the developments in Johor, ultimately they are also developing. So in the event that such things happen, then I think personally it would be prudent if we were to try to make ends meet on our own. So as to whether we'll get there, we probably will get there, but not at the moment. Yeah. Yes.
So on the financing of the World Bank, the member states I mentioned, we've got the developed countries and the graduate countries. So there are so Singapore actually was a borrower once. In fact, they borrowed a loan for the Malaysia water supply, and also for the docks for the first port development there and logistics. And they graduated, as do many other countries in the region and elsewhere. And so the graduates in the developed countries lend money or pledge money, against which, or guarantees against which are then we leverage on the capital markets, and then we on-lend. And there are two types of lending. There's the one which is to the poorest countries, so Cambodia and Laos will benefit from that. Vietnam is just graduating from it, but where it's at very cheap money. It's 40-year money at 1% per annum. And then the middle-income countries that would include Indonesia, for example, they borrow money on concessional terms, so it's cheaper than if they go to the commercial markets, but it's not as cheap as is offered to Vietnam, to Cambodia and Laos.
Okay, I think we're at about 9 o'clock. One more quick one? Okay, Ken. Then we'll have to wrap up.
Sorry, water is very close to my heart. I think it's a serious matter. I'd like to have a short questions for both doctors. First of all, nanotechnology. Can we, at this moment, filter up to what size to make sure the water is purified? Nowadays, a lot of sunblocks, cosmetics are using those. Are we able to have the technologies to do it? Number two is about Singapore. To put in perspective, how much water we generate for one HDB block means how much energy we need to use is something more relevant than the numbers you quote just now. I don't understand it from a public point of view, and therefore I cannot be dissuaded to use less water. Can you maybe Dr. Pang, try to figure it out that how much we need to generate the water to supply to a block of flat, and it means we need to burn how many energy to light up the bulbs for one HDB block. Then I can understand more significantly how much energy we're using it. The reason I brought this out is because I saw a documentary about Taiwan by the Taiwan channels. They are saying that they are now having a problem. The problem is power pollution. As you mentioned, we are shifting from water solution to a power problem. In this particular documentary, they say that PM 2.5 is the main culprit that causes cancer to most women in Taiwan nowadays, even though they are non-smoker, because of pollution. In that case, they're using coal. Not that Singapore are not using coal, I think, but we're using something else and it burns. So we are shifting from cleaning the water to polluting the air. So water you can still choose to purify, but air, how do I choose what to breathe? So my point now here is that while we are shifting from water to power, how much are we doing it? And on top of it, are we polluting in another form? And the other question for Dr. Pang is that why are we still a bit stingy in promoting water conservation at home? You only show us in the PUBBM what is the average, and are you above average or below average? But you are having devices, you are trying to suggest which particular toilet is using most water, which particular industry is using most water, but you are not promoting it, you know. You are trying trust at this area. I think it's a bit slow. Using Singapore standard, that's a bit slow. All right. So for this, I hope you could give us some answer. Thank you.
So, well, we're into overtime, so let's keep this short, and then maybe the two of you guys may even need to get together and talk. But I'll just really quick. The nanoparticle is a very big topic. We have a collaboration with Harvard School of Medicine looking at different exposures, but the majority of nanoparticle exposure happens through the application of cosmetics, paint, inhalation, PM 2.5, this kind of thing. In water, we absolutely could remove it if we use a membrane. We can remove atoms. When we desalinate, we're removing single atoms, let alone a nanoparticle. So we can do it. More research is definitely good, and we are doing that research.
Hi, I must say that I do not have an answer to the question of how much energy that converts or how much light bulb. So frankly, I do not have. The average water, the amount of water everyone consumes in Singapore is you are using about 143 liters per person per day. So that is probably, if you convert it to 1.25 liters of water, maybe over 10 to 15 bottles. That is what you use every day for your drinking, your cooking, your showers, and things like that. So that is some sense of perspective, like how much water each person is using. As to your second question, as to whether you are asking along the lines of giving you instant or more regular or more real-time feedback of your water consumption patterns, right? And perhaps to see whether it is possible to pinpoint down to which activity in your family or your household is consuming the water, so the water demand side of that equation. So let me first categorically state that water demand, so just now I've covered what we do for water supply, which is trying to up the supply through desalination and water reuse. So the other big part, of course, is water demand management, which I didn't talk a lot about, but that's largely because a lot of work that has been done has been invisible behind the scenes. So why do I say that? So what I mean to do, what I mean is that a lot of appliances that you use nowadays are supposedly more water efficient than previously. So for example, back in maybe 2009, we first started to have that so-called the mandatory water efficiency labeling scheme. So that's when we started labeling all the fittings of taps, basins, flushing systems with water efficiency labels. So over time, when more models of these appliances become available, the market such that the prices are about the same for water efficient and less water efficient appliance, we start to phase out the less water efficient items. So unconsciously, all these appliances get built into your homes. So new developments, when you do renovation, they are mandated by law to now use the more water efficient items. So your taps are now more water efficient. So these are the work that we have done behind the scenes to create a market for water efficient appliances that's used. And of course, your question about whether we engage people to try to educate them in terms of water conservation, yes, we do. The target audience are largely school-going kids. And of course, there are some community events. So specifically to your question as to whether we can give out real-time information to people, yes, I think you're referring to the fact that we have announced recently that we are going out to do automated meter infrastructure trials. These are the facts that we are trying to replace some of the water meters in your house to one that can send signals to your cell phone as to what your real-time water consumption is. So we have done some trials in this area. Yes, I do agree. What it means is that we are sending your water consumption patterns to your cell phone through an app over intervals that allows you to really know how much you're using at each moment. This particular trial is completed. I think we are currently growing out it on a bigger scale. And if I can say, you can probably look forward to some of these things in the next in this year. So that one is yes, it's high time, and we would probably move in this area quickly. Yeah, once we can get the technology sorted out. Yeah.
Okay. Shall we give our speaker and the panelists a round of applause for their sharing? Fantastic. Of course, thank you very much for your participation, especially the great questions. And for those who haven't done this, can you please proceed? Just take probably 2-3 minutes very fast. And before we end off, I think I would like to present them a small token of appreciation. Thank you, Dr. Pang. So, if you are interested, our talk for next month will be held on the 22nd of February, and the topic is called Geopolitical and Geoeconomic Trends, What Lies Ahead for Singapore. It's going to be a very timely topic, and it's going to be delivered by the Dean of our College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Joseph Liao. So please sign up if you have time, and I'll see you again next month. And again, for those who are celebrating Lunar New Year, Happy Lunar New Year, and remember to collect your Mandarin oranges while walking out. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.